if you compare the Kurdish regions in Iraq with the rest of Iraq right now, I would say that overall, well, it's quite ambiguous. On one level, women are doing much better because the overall security situation is much better. I mean, I was able to walk around freely in Abid and Suleimania, which I wouldn't dare to do in Baghdad these days. So on this level, it is much better. But you have a big difference in Iraqi Kurdistan between women who are urban middle-class women and women who live in the countryside. And one of the big paradoxes, and many of us are trying to understand this phenomenon, is that while overall you have a kind of opening up, you have it's being sold as the success story. I mean, people are investing in it, education is flourishing, but actually honor killings and female suicides right now have taken on epidemic proportions. Right? So when I went to Iraqi Kurdistan, I was really quite struck by this contradiction. On the one level, yes, I saw that it was quite okay for women to be out there in the public sphere. They didn't have to be worried to be kidnapped or to be shot at. I know that in terms of women who go to university, numbers are increasing in terms of girls getting school education. But when it comes to violence against women on a sort of more domestic scale, it's actually worse than it was a couple of decades ago. Sometimes what looks like a suicide, which is, you know, I said the sort of traditional way of people killing themselves in Kurdish areas, is through burning. So actually we sometimes don't know whether it was actually honor killing covered up as a suicide, because, you know, then you have a burnt body and you cannot really tell. But they do think that there is an increase, and well, you know, it has something to do with depression, with the lack of ability to express themselves in other ways. Sometimes it's a cry for help. I mean, as you find in the West as well, you know, often people don't really mean to kill themselves, but they find that no one is paying attention to their needs, and so it's a kind of cry for help. Unfortunately, if you actually put benzene over your body or petrol and you burn yourself, then there's a good chance that you won't survive it.
We have done a research on the issue, the female suicide problem in Turkey plus in Kurdistan, Iraq, in Kurdish region, because this has been like widely. It's happened mostly among the Kurdish women and in Kurdish region. Of course, there are a lot of reasons. You can put a lot of social, economical, and political conditions and questions behind why is happening and why is happening in that particular region, and what might be the reason behind it. We have published a report. Of course, you cannot put any single condition behind it, but one of the main reasons behind that one is that the conditions that Kurds live, the issue hasn't been addressed. The Kurds left in a position that their problem hasn't been addressed, and it's not going to be addressed in the near future. That creates a certain amount of tendency in the region and differences, basically.
بێگومان ڕەنگە ئێمە هەنە زانیاری بەم باو ڕەنگە پێسەیر بێ کە ئێمە حیزبێکی لە 148 ئەندامەکانمان ئافرەتە. ئێستا ئێمە لە 148 ئەندامەکانمان ئافرەتە و ئێمە 3 ئەنداممان لە سەرکردایەتی یەکگرتووە ئافرەتەیە و لە مەکتەبی سیاسی ئەندامی ئافرەتمان هەیە، جگە لە هەموو دام و دەستگاکانی ئێمە کە ئافرەتمان هەیە. بەڵێ و ئێمە لە ڕیزی پەرلەمانتارەکانە لە هەرێمی کوردستان 3 پەرلەمانتاری ئافرەتمان هەیە، لە بەغاش پەرلەمانتارێکی ئافرەتمان هەیە. بە کورتی ئێمە لە ڕوانگەی ئێمەوە هەموو تنوتیژیەک دەرحەق بە ئافرەت قەدەغەیە و هەموو ئەو تاوانانەی کوشتن لە کوردستانە کراون ئیداناکەین و بە تاوانێکی دژی ئیسلامی دانین، چکم هەتا نەبە گوێرەی قانون کە هەنێ قانونێکەیە لێرە، قانونی عقوباتی عێراقی تا ڕادەیە لایەنگری پیاوە، بەڵام ئەگەر بە پێی سەرەتاکانی هەتا شەریعەتی ئیسلامی بێ، هەموو ئەو ئافرەتانەی لە کوردستان کوژراون نە ئەبووە یەکێکیان کوژرێ، چکم لە شریعەتی ئیسلامی بۆی ئافرەتێ تەنانەت ئەگەر ئەوانەی بڕواشیان بۆ هەیە لەسەر خیانەتی زەوجی یا زیناکردن بکوژدێ ئەبێت 4 شایەت پرۆسەی سێکس و جنسەکان بینی بێ ئەنجام کوژدێ بۆیە ئەمە بە بەشێک لە ئەو دواکەوتویە کۆمەڵایەتیە و ئەو قۆناغی ئینتیقالی هەرێمی کوردستانە پێیتێ پڕەوە ئەو ناگیرگیری و نائارامیەی کە لە وڵاتەیە هەیە و خۆشبەختانە لە دەیان هەزار ئەندامی یەکگرتووی ئیسلامی کوردستانە تاکو ئێستا یەک ئەندامی ئێمە لە دوور و نزیکۆ تۆمەتبار نییە بە کوشتنی یەک ئافرەت لە هەموو کوردستان.
You know, in Iraqi Kurdistan, as many other contexts where there are liberation struggles, you find that Kurdish women were involved in the Peshmerga. I mean, they were actually fighting, women, you know, fighting, carrying arms, but also very much supporting the male fighters. And so in that context of a people fighting a liberation struggle, women have played an active role. And you find that some of the women who were Peshmerga now have prominent political positions linked to one of the 2 political parties. And then since 1991, really, you know, since the de facto semi-autonomous region, you know, after the Gulf War and the establishment of the safe haven, in Iraqi Kurdistan, in contrast to the rest of Iraq, there was actually a flourishing of a civil society. And at the forefront, you had women's rights activists, women's organizations, civil society. So on that level, yes, women actually have historically played a role. But again, you know, when we speak in terms of numbers, you know, that women always presented a minority, but they were part of it. But when you really look deeply, you find that women and women's issues are marginalized within the Kurdish political struggle. When the issue was getting rid of Saddam, you know, women's rights would come second to the wider issue of fighting the Ba'ath regime. Or women's issues come second to the fight for the greater Kurdistan. And I think now I spoke to many women's rights activists who expressed their disappointment and disillusionment. You know, they thought, well, now that we are in a position where we have our own government, we have the parliament, still our politicians do not really consider women's rights a priority. Yes, lots of lip service is being paid to it, but obviously in a situation where people are struggling over issues, big issues such as federalism, the status of Kirkuk, the first issue that is being negotiated away are women's rights. And that is cause of much frustration for many Kurdish women's rights activists.
I think there's certainly been a clear and noticeable attempt to bring more women into positions of authority within the KRG and into the Kurdistan National Assembly. And traditionally, women in Kurdistan have always held positions of prominence within political parties, within the government structures as well. There is a little bit of schizophrenia, though, within Kurdistan. On the one hand, in I suppose the public sector and in the political parties, you do often find women in positions of prominence, whereas in home and in private life, there is something of a problem with the role of women in society. That's very clear. Kurdistan has pretty horrific examples of honour killings and conservative views of the role of women in society. But I think if we look at what's happening within the governmental structures themselves, there is an interesting and noticeable move towards empowering women to a greater effect. Whether this is window dressing or not is another question, but if you meet some of the women who have these positions, you wouldn't accuse them simply of being window dressing of a scheme that's just hiding a wider patriarchal system. They would probably bite your head off if you said that, and these can be tough people. So I think perhaps the way the KRG has empowered women is something they should be applauded for. It needs to filter down into wider Kurdish society, which is still very, very traditional and conservative at its core. But it's an interesting picture.
للرانجي إما أفرد بوي هي ببقى أميداري قشتي حزب كمان ببقى سروكي هرمي كردستان ببقى وزير ببقى برلمانتار وبيستا ما في أزادي هالبجاردني هاوسري خويه بيدور بينها متنو توجيكوا ما فا أزياء مدني وسياسي وكمالات يكاني بطاوتي بردستبه بوي إما خومن ببشه لبري إصلاح زانين بو باشكرتني جاني أفرتان لولاتي إما.
I personally think it's a good thing. It's a first good step if any party, whether it is the Communist Party or the a liberal party or an Islamic party, has women. I mean, personally, if I have a choice between 10 Islamist men and 10 Islamist women, I'd like the women to be there as well, which doesn't mean, of course, that they represent women's rights issues. I mean, which is one of the things that we see in the Iraqi parliament, where there is the quota of 25%, and we see that most of the women in the Iraqi parliament are either the wives or the sisters or the daughters of male conservative politicians, and I suspect it's very similar in the Islamic party. Okay. However, having said that, I think we need to give it some time, and I think that as time goes by and when women are exposed to this political experience, they will stop just looking around before a vote to see what their male relatives are voting and start to establish their own political voice. But certainly numbers alone are not enough. I think it's a very first step, but we know there's a big difference. I mean, women could be their own worst enemies, in terms of actually not promoting, but even hindering women's rights struggle. I know that even the other parties, there are some women there who are actually making a case for women's rights, but many of the Kurdish women in parliament are first and foremost members of the specific political party with specific orientation, and also nationalists. I mean, I think that's a big tension in the Kurdish political arena, that there is a kind of tension, contradiction between a kind of women's rights agenda and a nationalist agenda. There were sort of some historical points when they came together, but I think we now have come to a point where there's sort of a tension where all, whatever political party women feel that they have to sort of take a step back to actually, because now the big issues are being discussed again.
These are the most vulnerable part of the society, women and children. And the traditional structure of the Kurdish society doesn't help these people to get enough support and advice or encourage from a male-dominated society to integrate into conditions that they didn't want to be living in. For example, most of the women committing suicide in Turkey, in Kurdish women, have IDP background. These people were living in a village in a peaceful conditions, probably in a conditions that is enough for them to live and survive, and then they were forced to the cities and big cities to live another life. There are a lot of there's stricter control by the male in the cities over the women in order to prevent anything in their understanding mistaken to happen, or she goes and do something that they don't want to appreciate or they don't want to accept it. So that creates a lot of other pressure among the families on the women, and that there's some sort of impact on these suicides. There's some sort of reason for this one, but there are a lot of other reasons behind this one. We have done a big report for the European Parliament, commissioned by the European Parliament, and we will continue to do that one. I mean, in Kurdish region as well, I mean, they have ministries dealing with women issues. They have created certain things there. There are a lot of things needs to be done, but this is not something that only a government can do it through passing one very strict law and saying or harsh punishment. It has to be other work has to be done. For example, you need to go and talk to the community leaders, you need to go and talk to the people who delivers very effective messages to the society to change their view and stop such activities and see the stories from different angles. There are a lot of things has to be changed within the society, but society is a very traditional. Religion is there as a factor for a long time. This is going to take a long time. It's a very social evaluation problem, but it's going to take a long time.
أما وكو بارتي ديمقراطي كردستان كدولة أساسية من لحكومة هرمي كردستان هي للرجاء حكومتها هول من ذاك أو كالتورة اجتماعية لكردستان هي بالنسبة أفراد كم بكريت طبيعي بين أو كالتورة زياتر بيش بكوي وإستا بيش كوتنشي طبيعي باش لو روانجوا بلام أجر ورات تماشي لندن بكا إحصائية وقرا بزانا لندن روجانا سن أفراد بيادة كجري ولا كردستاني تصور ذا كم نسبة إيرا زياتر نية لويندر بلام وكدري ليرانا إعلام زور جوري كرديا أجنا طبيعية يعني نسبة كشتني أفراد لواشنطن ولا باريس ولا لندن مقارنة بإيران تصور ذا كم عيني شذبي أما النار ما ظاهرانية هي لوروي أما ملتكين هر ملتك عادة وتقاليد خوي هي بداخو يعني أو عادة وتقاليدنا لزور ولاتاني بيشكوتوش هي ليرانش هي بلا مسيطرنية وعادة وتقاليد كما عندك حالة دبي بلا هو أويا استثناء شائعة كوانية شائعة بروايبة بيشكوتنو بحقي أفراد هي وأفراد لكردستان رولي كاريجري هي أفراد لبرلمان 25 صوتي هي وزيري أفراد من هي لدام دزقا كان هي أو هي بلام مسألة أوي كبرامبر أفراد دكري مثلا أفراد استا آزاد كاربكا أفراد آزاد الدور والبقري استا لهولير أما زياتر لا سياسات مدير مكتب من هي مدير مدرسة حكومة هيتي زياتر لمدير سياسات مدير مدرسة مدير ابتدائي ومتوسط وإعدادية لواني لو سياساتي 150 أفراد بي كواتا أفراد دوري هي أفراد عندهم برلمان أفراد وزيرة أفراد مديري مكتبة أفراد ماموستاي زانكويا أفراد دوري هي بلام عندك عادة وتقاليد هي بيوندي با أوي بيدرين غسل العار يعني شرف لسه شرف يعني عندك خلق هي عندك شتى تقبلناك أو أنا هي أوش لأوروبا شيء طبيعي بويا حتى عندما إيش دكين استابتها بتجنا بسروي شيء حكومة ليجنا شيء خاص دانايا لبو حدانان لبو أو تندو تيجي كماني برامبر أفراد دكري أو لجنا وزيرين أو خو سرپرشتي دكات.
Yes, ironically, since 1991, since Kurdish political parties had a level of control over the Kurdish region, we actually found that both honor killings and female suicides, which mainly happen through burning, women burning themselves, have been on the increase. Okay, that's kind of has been documented. Actually, an Iranian scholar by the name of Shahzad Mojab, she has written extensively on that. And initially, it was very much ignored by both political parties, and with the kind of justification, well, it's part of our Kurdish culture. You know, so for decades we had the Ba'ath regime oppressing us as Kurds, imposing certain practices, trying to suppress our culture. And so it was packaged as this is part of our authentic Kurdish culture, there's nothing we can do about this. And then of course lots of distraction. I mean, you had you know, the Kurdish parties fighting each other, and then of course the sort of run-up to the invasion. But now there has been a shift in terms of the sort of political parties, government actually actively taking a stand against it, officially taking a stand against it. In the Kurdish constitution, honor killings are now explicitly a criminal offense, you know, which is quite new. However, in terms of implementation, not much has been done. Again, rather than a perpetrator of an honor killing, rather than him being brought to justice in front of a court, you find that political parties would still try to mediate on a sort of family level, and they would send a high official. And so again, it's something that will be sort of hushed under. It doesn't actually get to a sort of full process of justice. And as I said before, too many other distractions, you know, in terms of the overall political process in Iraq, oil, discussions about federalism and so on. So while on paper, and I think again, I mean, it's an important first step, there is now a recognition there is a problem and we're against it and we oppose it. It's a crime. In practice, not much is done to actually oppose it. And it's a complex issue. How do you fight this? I mean, things such as female suicides. I mean, I think one has to take a kind of holistic issue here. You find that overall when I went, there was a sense of, went last year in 2007, there was an overall sense of disillusionment. You know, this is now 4 years, we're now 5 years after, well, the Kurds call it a liberation, I would call it invasion. Still only 2 hours of electricity, widespread unemployment, sort of a sense that only those who are linked to the political elites actually have a chance of getting a job. Recognition that, well, actually now our new political leaders are as corrupt as the previous regime. Some woman told me over and over again, you know, we are so happy to get rid of Saddam Hussein, but now we find our new, whether it's Barzani or Talabani, and their respective cliques, in terms of corruption, in terms of needing connection to have access to resources. The system works the same as before. So there is a overall frustration at the level of, you know, sort of the majority of the population. And I think now seeing there is a kind of, the spectrum has, the horizon has expanded, there was hope, and this kind of frustration, on the one hand, I think, is contributing to the increase in female suicides, but on the other hand, is also contributing to the increase in honor killings and domestic violence. You know, in a situation where men cannot assert themselves in a traditional way in terms of breadwinners, in terms of having some kind of say within the way things are going, I think they're asserting themselves more within the very sort of traditional domestic sphere. And there's also this strange thing going on in terms of modern and traditional. I mean, there are all these stories, for instance, with mobile phones being the trigger for honor killings. So horrendous stories of, you know, boyfriends after, you know, a young couple split, and a boyfriend, because he's so upset, would send around a picture of his former girlfriend to lots of friends and family, and then her family got hold of this and were so outraged by it and killed her. And so you see there seems to be lots of different things going on that you have to work. I mean, women's rights are not just violated, you know, within the family. It's happening sort of larger. There are economic problems, there are social problems.
One of the advantages that the Kurds can take it, for example, there has been a huge amount of people. We are talking about 2 million, 3 million, I don't know exact figures, million people lived in Europe in exile within the Western societies, where all these ideas, opinions and lifestyles now seen as a question, one of the question in the region. They lived within that one. They made the cross, you know, they made marriages here, they married to other people, Western people. I think in that sense, I think the Kurds have a different understanding of that process. Of course, you know, anything, modernization is a painful process for every society, or postmodern society is always a threat to traditional societies. they have always difficulties to understand and digest that sort of lifestyle. It might be, but I think it might be a reason for people to keep the traditions alive by accusing others to do this one. I mean, you don't have to take all the Western values into your society, but you can have the good ones, which is a positive things, positive values about human rights and condition of women, equality, justice, fairness, and all these things. Well, there's nothing wrong with that one, taking into that one, or using mobile phone, dressing codes, and etc. I do remember when I was, I grown up in the village. I was born in the village. I grown up in the village. I could see the women, although the women had the traditional roles within the society to do, tasks based, for example. You have to look after the household, basically. You have to do the domestic work at home. But at the same time, I could see in a big gatherings, I could see also the women were chairing the meetings. Women were the leader of the tribe, or women were the leading figures. And I never seen women were excluded from the madam gatherings, or they were treated differently to a certain extent. So there are, in reality, in Kurdish tradition, and there are bases for equality of the women and taking part in decision making or leadership. I think we have to consider on more to that, rather than certain things brought by other influences, such as probably the Islam to a certain extent, into society, that putting women in different conditions and the second-class position.
And I certainly think that the Kurdish government is very much concerned about its reputation. I think that many urban Kurds are outward looking, and as people everywhere in the world, I mean, there is a kind of global consumption that wherever you are, I mean, even my relatives in Baghdad, I was shocked under the sanctions period. Teenagers were sort of aspiring to global Western music or dress code. I think that is something you find also in Kurdistan. But again, you find there's a gap between the kind of urban culture and the rural culture. So I do think that pressure from outside helps on the level of government, trying to not just sort of, but the important thing is that it shouldn't just be pressure to then project that they're doing something, but with some kind of accountability and trying to see it through. But there's something else happening. Maybe not as much in Iraqi Kurdistan, but in the rest of Iraq. But even I would say, with the rising Islamic trend or Islamist trend in Kurdistan, sort of the sense of the outside world, the West, trying to impose its Western value. And of course, women are key to this. Women are used in this sort of struggle, between East and West. In any struggle where there's conflict, women are always used as markers of us versus them. Our women are dressed properly, are behaving properly. Their women are loose. Their women are oppressed. Our women are emancipated. And it's not a coincidence that Bush went to war to liberate Afghani women, went to liberate Iraqi women. The problem is that for certain parts of the population, the louder someone like President Bush shouts women's liberation while occupying Iraq, there will be a backlash from certain quarters. Not now, of course, from the quarters of the, from Barzani or Talabani, because, that's part of their project, but certainly from the dissident or oppositional Islamic parties. I mean, that would be part of their rhetoric as well. We want to keep our tradition. The West, see, they're trying to impose their ideas about women. We don't want that. You have quite a number of women's organizations. Actually, they're mushrooming, and but we were surprised to see how closely many of them were linked to one of the two parties, linked both in terms of funding, but also in terms of actually political affiliation. and those who were not were struggling. So if you are a women's rights organization that's either linked to Barzani or Talabani, you have support, right? And you can maybe sort of push the boundaries a little bit, but you wouldn't, because they sort of know what their limits are. But those who are pushing the boundaries, those who try to stay independent, they have a difficult time. And they're often the only way, if they don't want to be linked to one of the two parties, they end up getting funding from the International Republican Institute or USAID, or, well, funders from all over the world. But I was quite surprised how many organizations actually got money from the International Republican Institute, which, to my mind, is not, if you sort of look at the website, they're actually quite anti-feminist. They have a very sort of conservative neoliberal idea about women's rights. They use sort of the language of women's empowerment, but it's not really looking at the way gender works on all levels of society. There was one incident when hundreds of people, actually thousands of people in Sulaymaniyah demonstrated. There was a sort of quite a riot. I think it was in 2006. And this was basically because people were fed up with the lack of electricity, lack of work. So it was a kind of anti-government demonstration. And the government, well, this is in Sulaymaniyah's Talabani-controlled PUK, clamped down on it and arrested hundreds of demonstrators. There were a few NGOs, amongst them some women's organizations, who helped to mediate between the demonstrators and the government to release the demonstrators. And they sort of, tried to support the demonstrators. After that incident, their funding was cut. They received, I think it was something like $1,000 before, because they had taken a stand. So they now had to look for foreign funding to do that. So there are limits, really. Again, if you compare it to, let's say, neighboring Iran, or you compare it to the rest of Iraq, no, it's good, right? But why do you have to compare it to, such a bad situation? We want better, and many women's rights activists I talked to complained about the fact that they have to be very careful, that they're being harassed if they criticize the government so much, that they depend on the goodwill of the international community, and also the tensions between the two political parties are also playing out in terms of tensions in civil society, because as many of the organizations are linked to one of the parties, you find that it's not just about women's rights, it's also about sort of putting a specific agenda across.
I think at least on the agenda, and seriously people are seriously considering, there are a lot of women rights organizations in Europe, in diaspora, working on the issue, trying to influence on government's policy on this one. They are organizing events, conferences, and etc. I think some of them are taking place in Kurdistan region as well. The government is listening. I think they are trying to do something to a certain extent, but as I said, it's sometimes it's a huge issue, big issue, and it's not going to be solved by passing a very strict law or becoming a police state to control such things. It will take time. I believe, but I think that everybody has to be very aware of the situation. Basically, the civil society groups, community leaders, human rights groups, women rights groups, society itself, and plus decision-making bodies, parliaments, and government.